Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I always love coming back to your country. I enjoy giving seminars at the universities throughout, as well as helping small and medium-sized business go global. Today we have, I think, one of the most unique panels ever in terms of the topic of entrepreneurship, and that's entrepreneurship in government. Now, some of you may say, well, is that absolutely possible? Can there be entrepreneurship in a governmental organization or in a public sector organization? And I say a resounding yes, there can be. And there's examples of it throughout the world. And today what we're going to do is I'm going to address the topic in an overview fashion, and then we're going to have a great expert group of panelists come up. Each of them will take some time to address the topic, and then we're really open for questions. And the last part of this is what I look forward the most, is to handling the questions from the audience, and so I really hope we have a lot of participation. Now, when we talk about government entrepreneurship, or the term I've coined is governpreneurship, I think there's several factors we need to think about in terms of that. The first of it is, what are the internal and external dimensions of this in terms of the environment? And as you can see on this slide, basically we have various aspects of the internal and the external dimensions that surround us in terms of having government entrepreneurship. The most important of each of these is the top one, and that is the internal politics and the external politics. And we're going to look at those briefly in just a minute. But it's important to understand that we do have an environment which takes place, which this thing called government entrepreneurship or government entrepreneurship occurs in. Now, this is the process which we see happening in various places, both at the city level, as well as the state level, as well as the national level in terms of government entrepreneurship being successful. First of all, we got to have the entrepreneurial process, or the entrepreneurial orientation. That, as you see, has three basic dimensions, and that's been discussed quite a bit today. First of all, somebody has to identify an opportunity. Second of all, they have to assess that opportunity. And third, they have to have the desire to have that opportunity become reality. And it's this last thing, the desire, is what's really interesting. And if you remember from yesterday and even on the panels this morning, today at lunch, when people ask what really is the different or distinguishing factor between an entrepreneur and a non-entrepreneur, and a lot of different things came about, but to me the real distinguishing factor is you got to just do it. I'll never forget, just a couple of months ago, one of my students came into my office. She had a great idea for a business venture. She already had $75,000 of funding from our angel network, and she also had a partnership with a Fortune 100 company. And I said, I'm really excited for you. I can't wait to see you start and grow your company. And tears came into her eyes, and she said, you know, I just can't do it. So if you think about the pressures of doing it outside the organization, and even the pressures in terms of what we call corporate entrepreneurship, or as labeled in this program, entrepreneurship, which is going to be the focus tomorrow, think of how hard it is to do this inside of a governmental agency or public sector organization. So we have to have this kind of entrepreneurial process that goes on. The second part of this equation, as you see here, is the whole concept of the organizational structure. And there has to be flexibility in this organization, and there has to be an opportunity for this organization to develop an entrepreneurship culture that allows people inside the public sector to be able to create something new of value. Now, these are the dimensions of the internal politics and the external politics, and these vary by whether it's the country and vary by region of the country, as well as whether it's in a larger city or a smaller metropolitan area. The one that's probably the most important in terms of the left-hand side, in terms of the internal politics, are the whole concept of the procedure or purchasing procedure. This makes a difference whether or not you are able to be more entrepreneurial or not in terms of elevating this whole process to a higher level. In terms of the external politics, of course, the whole concept of the court of public opinion. This becomes important for us because we have a lot of different constituencies we're trying to solve as a government organization, and we have to have those people satisfied in terms of that. So we do have these two concepts in terms of the internal politics and external politics, which makes a significant difference of whether we are able to have this entrepreneurial process take hold. Now, we've looked at this process on various levels, and we found various challenges that have to be overcome in order for it to occur. The first one, as you can say here, is very important, is the government policies, procedures, and rules and regulations. You'll hear again tomorrow when I identify this in my book on corporate entrepreneurship, which was just released in August. These are some of the inhibiting factors that have to be overcome. Too much rigidity, too much top-down, and that's one of the harder things for us to be able to have in terms of a governmental agency, which has to be self-reporting, and people want to see what's going on. There's also some personal restrictions in terms of hiring and firing, or some people need to be appointed in different levels. There's also limitations on the amount and type of rewards we're able to give. Remember, when you're an external entrepreneur, then you have a lot of opportunities to do things that you want to do in the reward system you want to have. We have limited managerial autonomy, or the fact that we have top-down autocratic decision-making. This makes it difficult to have this process occur in a governmental agency. We have the changing nature of governments. In fact, that they, on a regular basis, they change in terms of either through the political process or some appointed process, so this change constantly occurs. So we can't have a longevity and a history of having entrepreneurship occur. We have a long history in most governmental agencies of not having creativity, not having entrepreneurship. So we need to start this process and continue it. And finally, we need the structure and collaboration across sectors, which is very difficult in most governments, so that the Ministry of Labor is different from the Ministry of Economics, is different from the Ministry of Trade, and they tend to have their own agendas and their own things they're trying to do. Now, how does this all work in terms of what's going to happen in terms of this? We have to fund it. One of the neatest things that I've seen develop over the past years is these public-private partnerships. And these have been used in various situations in order to fund various projects we need to have. Whether it might be the mayor of a small fishing village who wants to have, suspends the fishing license fees and others for donations to contribute to a new school building. Whether it be a partnership between the building a shipyard at a large metropolitan area, or whether it be a partnership of trying to have a national policy on energy and energy consumption. So these public-private partnerships are becoming very much in vogue. They're ways to raise the capital we need to have these occur, and a way for the government to have more entrepreneurship occurring in their particular organization. The second way this can occur is through venture capital. And venture capital, a lot of times the government organizations will set up their own venture capital funds, not only to spur entrepreneurship in their region, but to fund their own internal projects. We have the regional funds in Germany, or the state funds in the United States, or the city fund in Austria, or your own funds here, right here in the kingdom. So we have these venture capital funds that are used to spur this, not only inside the governmental organizations, but equally as important for outside entrepreneurs to start their own businesses. And finally, of course, the age-old way to fund this is through taxes. Both taxes that we can have tax reductions. There's a way to reduce fees and licensing fees, as well as taxes, to stimulate what we want to have done, as well as, of course, the age-old increase in taxes. So it's important when we set up this, what we call entrepreneurship, to be able to have a funding source that's one that's going to be able to fund the kind of things we want to accomplish as a governmental unit. Finally, I want to introduce you to a book. It's a book that's just coming out. I wrote this with Amr Al-Duba, who's my co-author, who actually has a great case study in this called Sagio, who's the one who's sponsoring our conference today. And this book will be out in about 3 or 4 months. And what it basically has is 7 chapters. Each of the points we've talked about, from obviously an entrepreneur in the public sector to who is a governmental entrepreneur, all the way down to managing and funding the organization. Each of the chapters are filled with a lot of examples on a global basis. And then we go through and think we should really show how this works in terms of 4 real large case studies in terms of case histories. Sagia right here in the kingdom, Ireland, which used to be called the Celtic Tiger, which isn't such much of a tiger anymore, Singapore, which is a city that's really fascinating in the way it spurs its economic growth and how it continues to do, though. And then we did a private sector hospital in Geneva. So this sort of is the start of this whole process. I hope this conference is the start of people starting to look at this. I think this is the wave of the future in terms of what's going to happen, not only having entrepreneurship inside the governmental organization, but equally as important, have the government start supporting and funding and encouraging entrepreneurship in the private sector through individuals creating their own business, as well as in the corporate sector through what we call corporate entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship, depending on the term you want to do. In the studies we've done all over the world, the most interesting thing to me is the process is the same. In other words, when you start a company like I have and many of you have, we go through a basic process. We identify an opportunity, we assess that opportunity, we create some form of a business plan, and particularly if we need outside funding, we go get that outside funding, usually from our family and friends, and then the private investors called angels, then the venture capital community and the public equity market. And so we finance our company, and then we launch and grow our business. That process is the same, whether you do that in China, whether you do that in India, here in the Kingdom, or in the United States. What's different is the infrastructure in which that process takes place. That infrastructure is what makes a difference in those companies and the process they go about forming. That's what we need to think about in terms of this government entrepreneurship or governpreneurship, because that's the infrastructure we need to have to create a very strong economy and one that's continually open to change and innovation. So with those brief comments, I'd like to invite our panel up for their comments, and then I really look forward to addressing your questions, because I think this topic is going to be one you're going to see on agendas all over the world. Let's see. Whoa. Yeah. Okay, so we'll start off with Michael Andrew from Kpmg.
Thanks, Bob. And first of all, can I say what an honour it is to be invited to this conference and to appear on such an august panel, talking about what I think is one of the most important subjects in the world at the moment. And Bob, I could just borrow your slide.
Clicker? Be glad to.
I think my thesis is that there is much more entrepreneurial activity happening as we speak in the public sector than ever before. And it's really been driven by two factors. One is economic necessity in the West, where governments are basically facing significant budget pressure, both in the short and long term, declining tax basis, expenditure, collapse of their employment in certain economies, and so on. They're having to rethink the whole model as to how they can re-stimulate their competitiveness and how they can be much more austere in the way they actually manage the central budget. Equally, in the East, there's a different complex. We're currently facing a population of 9 billion people, a rising middle class, great use of social media, a great strain on energy, water, food resources going forward, requirements for infrastructure. New and innovative models have to be basically developed. So what I thought I'd do in the brief minutes I had available was just comment on some large trends that I see around the world and what I really regard as best practice in public sector entrepreneurship. First, and clearly one, is efficiency, is the order of the day. So you're seeing austerity measures as to how we can actually spend our money better, develop better outcomes from our services, or cut our costs. So you're seeing the UK government, for example, go through what we call the Quest program, going through and looking top to bottom down their efficiency of their government departments. 26 government departments now being benchmarked against their private sector peers, not against other government departments, and the outcomes that that's creating. You're seeing in Canada, the City of Toronto, go through and really assess what type of services it offers, it should be offering, what can be outsourced to the private sector, what is the cost-benefit analysis. But I can tell you, by far the most ruthless government here is China. When you go into those large state-owned enterprises and see the way that they are transforming the return on equity and investment they have in those operations, it's quite staggering. The second one I want to touch on is infrastructure. And I think there's two aspects here, at least. First, as Bob mentioned, public-private partnerships. There is something like a $740 billion infrastructure deficiency in the world. There's no way that this can be funded out of current government resources and reserves. So we are starting to see now in 110 countries across the world, we're currently working on public-private partnerships. And what are we learning? First of all, that there needs to be some depth in the marketplace. So therefore, you need to be able to put a long-term plan forward for financial investors to be interested. You need to introduce much more flexibility in risk sharing and to be able to change the nature of your project as circumstances change. Equally, what is working for public-private partnerships at the moment is the volatility in equity markets, because it means that your financial investors now have actually found that they actually want a long-term sustainable return, because what they're trying to do is really try and match their income to their long-term liabilities, whether it be pension liabilities, whether it be government expenditure. So infrastructure is an ideal investment, and increasingly we're seeing a huge appetite in the sovereign wealth funds for these types of activities. Then you go into strategic infrastructure, where you have countries that are now looking at the issues of energy security, food security, and how do I actually deal with these issues, or how do I create infrastructure which is actually going to attract investment to my country and actually stimulate a whole set of private sector investment, which will itself absolve some of the responsibilities that I have of government. And again, there are many good models here that are working in the world. The largest infrastructure project at the moment is through China, through Myanmar, through Thailand, opening up the largest port in the world away from the American fleet, basically trying to guarantee its security of supply chain logistics. When you look at China overseas, it's basically building railways and infrastructure that support access for resources and energy, so critical to its marketplace. You look at Singapore, creating centres of excellence to basically export services and get themselves higher up the food chain by basically co-sponsoring with private sector investors to be the regional hub, would be in accounting, management consulting, healthcare. They want to be the supplier to the ASEAN region in terms of being the centre of excellence and position themselves that way. Then you see Korea rolling out the best broadband system in the world, where 98% of its people now are shopping online, giving greater efficiency in terms of their own productivity, but the whole transformation in the way their supply chain operates. The third factor I then see is the real shift to long-term planning. And I think really, again, this has been driven very much from the East, where everyone now scrutinises that next 5-year plan from China to see what are the key industries that are being invested in, what are the major infrastructures, where are the geographies that those funds are going to flow. And what people don't properly understand is it's an interactive process. This plan takes a long time to develop, bottom up, top down. So when it is released at the Congress, it really already has had the buy-in for the various provinces and state governments. They then take 6 to 12 months, which is what is happening now, to put the right people in charge of the right projects. And the smart people around the world are saying, how can we vertically integrate into this massive stimulus that's coming along? And that is not just private sector, there's governments in the region who are starting to focus on how can I assist and support that supply chain model. Fourth is market expansion. As I said, you have countries like Singapore creating centres of excellence. The reality is the Doha round of trade talks is dead. Companies are really, and private sector investors no longer really want to invest on a country-by-country basis. And governments have woken up to this. So very entrepreneurially now, they're working together in clusters and in zones and in bilateral treaties to actually create broader markets which will actually offset the competitive disadvantage they might have through a smaller domestic population. So we're seeing negotiations in Africa, in Latin America, in the ASEAN group, really trying to create markets of much larger, more seamless, less regulation to actually encourage private sector investment. You've got countries like China, again, designating the fact that they want to go into the outsourcing market. There are 21 cities in China designated as part of the 5-year plan to be outsourcing centres to try and compete with the Indian phenomenon that we've seen in the last few years. Then we've seen, fifth, the smart use of technology. When I get out of my flat in Hong Kong in the morning, I take my smart card, I buy my breakfast, I buy my train ticket, I get straight to the airport, I swipe my card, I don't need any proof of identity, I go straight through without customs, and I'm on a plane within 45 minutes of leaving my apartment, which is basically an hour's drive. This is the sort of smart use of technology that's really starting to see and occur. We're also seeing Singapore totally convert its medical and health system into electronic record keeping. Totally online at the moment, to just take, and imagine the efficiency that you start to get when you link hospitals with doctors, with customers and so on. Then you have the private sector interface. More and more public sectors are saying, gee, we're very large in supply chain logistics, inventories. What can we learn from the private sector? Can we do interchanges? And I'm seeing large airlines, large mining companies actually exchange people with the public sector to try and actually stimulate the best ideas from both and exchange this on a much more regular basis. And finally, I'd say the biggest other influence I'm seeing in the world at the moment is the increasing lift in educational standards around the world. The reality is, in China, the best graduates go into government. They don't go to the private sector, they go to government. And the reward and recognition system is such that that's where they're actually valued. Equally, if you look at the educational standards and the marks around the world, the major international universities, you'll see it's those emerging countries where there's a real thirst and hunger, an appetite for those skills, which is really coming through and permeating itself. And you have many governments are right behind the entrepreneurial investment of making sure that their students participate in those institutions. And finally, as Bob explains very well in his book, government is a very special sector. And to actually create schools that actually focus on MBA level of qualifications for people in public service is showing, I think, great entrepreneurial foresight and starting to really show a bright young class of people coming through who are really driving an entrepreneurial spirit in government.
Great. Bob. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. So, Richard Booker from OECD will have some comments.
Thank you. I'm going to try to stand up so I'm not constantly turning my back on people. And let's see if I can figure out the gizmo. No? Hey, there we are. Get rid of that one. All right, technology always fails me.
Yeah.
Oh, there, we made something. Okay, I just wanted to show a little bit about who we are and what we do. And our goal is to help people make better policy, help people in government make better policy. It's evidence-based. We collect a lot of data. We do a lot of studies, but we do them with people in government, exchanging practices, looking at different ways of doing things, and often coming up with recommendations and standards that apply globally because we've looked at a lot of different situations and those who are involved in this business agree. And frankly, that's one of the first areas of entrepreneurship in government. A lot of people sharing ideas with each other, getting the policy makers together to look at what worked and what doesn't. What doesn't work is often more helpful as you're planning new policy than what did work for somebody else. But you get ideas and you think about, could I make that work in my environment? And the whole goal is with our slogan at the bottom, better policies for better lives. We have 34 member countries. That's kind of the blue, but the light blue is Russia on its way in. The red are the major partners that we cooperate with, and we could add another color, which is yellow, the programs in the Middle East and North Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. So it is not a select amount of experience, and we're interested in anybody who's making policy in the areas that we work with. That's a lot of different areas. That's a lot of different areas. I won't go through them all. What is interesting to us, I think, is that more and more we're doing cross-cutting areas. So when you're looking at something like innovation, innovation is as much about economics as it is about science and research. It's the availability of financing, it's a competitive environment, it's an opportunity to start business and run a business, it's your tax system, it's the skills, and the availability of good employees, it's labor market policies. A lot of very competitive economics leads to much more innovative societies, and the same thing applies even if it's in government. If you look at, we have a lot of work going on right now on skills, combination of education and labor policies. Skills turn out to be one of the best factors in improving the quality of industry, keeping up in a globally competitive world for individuals and for countries. One of the first places to start with innovation for the public sector is take a good look at your state-owned enterprises. A A lot of places, especially in this region, they account for more than half of the GDP. Major source of employment, that's one of the reasons why they're set up. They often provide key services in key areas, energy, transport, telecoms. You can think of quite a lot beyond driver's licenses and fishing licenses. So what do we've looked at state-owned enterprises around the world. We've got some recommendations and guidelines on state-owned enterprises, especially on the corporate governance side of things. And one of the first things is to ensure a level playing field. State-owned enterprises, because of the government supports, have a tendency to crowd everybody else out. And I went back to innovation being a factor where competition and entrepreneurship have to be there for innovation to take place in an economy. So if you've got the government enterprises crowding everybody else out of the market and enjoying just insane, large numbers of privileges, then you're not going to have the entrepreneurial environment throughout your economy. So you've got to look at how to define the state-owned enterprises and make sure that private companies can compete. The second is, as I said, define an ownership policy, define the goals. State enterprises, like any enterprises, need to have an ownership structure that keeps accountability within the organization, that defines their goals. Now, it may not be the same as a private enterprise. Private enterprise set up to maximize shareholder value. It may be to provide employment or guarantee the availability of certain raw materials or manage a public resource. But you can define that and you can set up the structures in the state enterprise so that's what it does and not get involved in areas where private sector can take care of things better. And the final thing is ensuring transparency in state-owned enterprise operations, especially when you move from being a state-owned enterprise to privatization. A lot of the rancor in the world these days, some of the turmoil in the Arab world, if you look at what people are yelling about in the streets, it's because they felt that state-owned enterprises were operated in an untransparent manner. So this is one that I think is on everybody's mind these days, including examples of privatizations that have been carried out over the past 2 or 3 decades from Russia onwards, where there's enormous criticism about how it was done. So transparency, as in all things, turns out to be key when it's state-owned enterprises. What about entrepreneurship and governance itself? How do you engender that? How do you get that? Well, some sense it's starting with a framework environment, starting with the ability for people to do things, authority, skills, competition among agencies, whatever. Introducing innovation in the delivery of public services, electronic government, and new technologies is one of the key areas. And we're working with a lot of people. We're doing work now with the Egyptian government on electronic governance. We've seen some very good examples in the United Arab Emirates of the introduction of electronic governance. And the only caveat here is when you introduce new technologies and make services available electronically, it's important to sort of organize the process in a new way and not just turn paper into pixels and actually make it easier for people. So instead of having people fill out forms online, have them put in some data and use the computers to call up data and make it easier for them, so that if they put in their postal code, the city and the state, whatever, pop up. So you're actually changing the process and making it easier for people to do it online. The second is, as I think both of you mentioned, is public-private partnerships. Hopefully this is the best of both worlds. It's not government resources being used for private purposes, but it's rather private resources contributing to government purposes. And that's, once again, where defining the goals is very important. But public-private partnerships are working in a lot of sectors around the world. Water is one that you see both on a national and a state level. We're doing some work now with Tunisia on water. We have guidelines on public-private partnerships that are based on our experience around the world. But you see it in transport, telecoms, a whole lot of areas where bringing the public and the private sector together works. And finally, within government itself, you can do things so that people are given rewards and incentives for good performance, and where you focus not on the process of doing something, but on the outcome. So the process is not to create a lot of files, the process is to deliver a lot of driver's licenses. And you can, one way or the other in various government services, if you start defining outcomes in terms of results, then you can not only give people an incentive to innovate the service, but you can also give them rewards if they manage to do so. So that's some of the stuff that we've seen in the OECD by looking at innovation and entrepreneurship generally, but also looking at it in state enterprises in the public sector. And I just want to thank you all again, Satya and Professor Hisrich, for having us here and letting us talk. Thanks.
Great. Before I introduce our next speaker, don't forget your questions. Let's start thinking about them so we can have it. And remember the first talk we had, we're going to keep the questions short and to the point, and you can introduce yourself before you ask your questions. Our final speaker today is Chad Evans from the Council on Competitiveness. So Chad, we look forward to having your comments.
Thanks so much. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to Sagia for hosting us. It's been a great experience here in Riyadh, and I'm very grateful to be here to represent the Council. And I'll give you just a quick primer on who we are. The Council is a private sector, nonpartisan think and do tank based in Washington, D.C. And we're a membership organization of CEOs, university presidents, and labor leaders. And we just turned 25 years old in December. And our mission over the past 2.5 decades has really been to the development of policies and actions that drive the standard of living, productivity, and eventually the prosperity of the average American. And so the story that I'm going to try to tell today, while it resonates with, I think, a little bit about what we've heard, is going to be somewhat US focused, but I hope to tie it up at the end and elevate it to the conversation we've already had and try to have perhaps some cross-country comparisons, but through the lens of the US experience and entrepreneurship. So why is entrepreneurship important? For our council, there are a couple of reasons, and I'm going to just outline 3. First of all, job creation. Small, young firms tend to have created most of the new jobs in the United States. And in fact, if you look at data from 1980 to 2005, net job creation in the United States is solely accounted for by small and medium-sized firms, not large firms. That's significant. I'm going to come back to this point at the end because there are some more recent troubling trends in the United States that run counter to that. And that's a sort of a point of question, I think, in the future of US economic growth that I'd like to talk about. Entrepreneurship is also critical for productivity growth at the national level. Young, small, productive companies tend to be a major contributor to overall national productivity growth. And finally, I think this is the more obvious point, startups tend to play a critical role in technology commercialization, transfer, and radical innovation in the US case. So now I'm going to turn to, I would call it the good, the bad, and the ugly about the US entrepreneurship story. And we'll start a little bit with the good. A quick snapshot, silver lining. The United States has been and remains one of the easiest places in the world to start a business. Whether you talk in terms of cost, you see there in a per capita income basis, it's relatively inexpensive for the average American or organization to start a company. It's also relatively easy to start a company quick in the United States, about 6 days. And that compares fairly well against, this is a small sample of countries, but this is based on the World Bank's really excellent Doing Business series of reports. Another critical sort of, I would say, positive driver for entrepreneurship in the United States over the past 50, 60 years has been this robust market for capital in the United States, whether we're talking about angel and venture capital or even things as like corporate venture, but also important, though relatively small compared to venture and angel, there are important public sector federal programs that have been critical for the success of small entrepreneurial firms. And I outlined just a few of those programs there, SBIR, STTR. But there are, I would say, some storm clouds on the horizon. If you look at the change in the number of private sector establishments that are created every year in the United States, you see a fairly significant decline over the past 4 or 5 years. 23% between 2007 and 2010 is 24% if you go back to the peak in 2006. this is important because I made the case, or tried to make the case, and we contend in many of our studies, that these new establishments are what are critical for the creation of jobs and innovative output in the United States. Concomitant with that drop in the number of establishments is, of course, a downtick in the number of jobs that are created by these new establishments. You see an even larger decline, nearly 50% over the decade between 1999 and 2010, and the number of jobs that were created by establishments that are less than 1 year old. This is, I think, a troubling sign in the US, and I think the question is this a fundamental break? Is this a fundamental juncture that we are now facing in the United States? And if so, is there a public sector response to this change in the entrepreneurial environment? A final point I'm going to mention in terms of storm clouds. We're talking a lot about entrepreneurship and startups over the past couple of days. I think it's also important, and the Council is beginning to undertake some work in this area, to move beyond the conversations of startups and to think about scale-up. How do you take startups and ensure that they are sustainable, that they're growing, they are resilient? And so, you know, I'm going to compare the US and China here. I don't want to pick on China. This could be, actually, there are many other countries where this could pertain. You see sort of four, I would say, platforms where the public sector has a role in the private sector. You know, if you look at US advantages in basic research and development, even touching upon applied research and development, the US public sector plays a fundamental role in funding entrepreneurial ventures. I think, however, when one begins to look at the commercialization and the development and testing of products, that's where we tend to see the traditional, what we call valley of death, the drop-off in government support for these types of ventures. I think that, you know, there are a lot of mechanisms that can overcome this first valley of death, and those are, I think, very well known and established. And for those companies that do survive and move on to the development and commercialization, I think we quickly begin to see where the United States, again, perhaps is trailing other more strategic approaches that we're beginning to see emerge around the world, and a second valley of death. And this is where we really are talking about scaling up. Anecdotal, but also some quantitative data that we've been gathering over the past year and one of our major initiatives on the future of US manufacturing. If you look at small and medium-sized firms that reach a revenue level of around $100 to $150 million, they are tending to move offshore. So in some sense, they're choosing to scale elsewhere. They're choosing to create certain value elsewhere outside of the US market. And there are several reasons for this. I won't go into all of them, but I'll touch upon a few because it resonates with some of the comments we've heard earlier. One of the reasons has to do with US immigration policy. Over the past decade, a relatively, compared to the history of the United States, closed-door approach to immigration. This is significant because if you look at the Fortune 500 in the United States, around 40% of those firms were either started by immigrants or the children of immigrants and are currently led by that class. So this is sort of the United States shooting itself in the foot in terms of scaling up entrepreneurial activity. I think a more fundamental point, and I'll get to this at the end again as I wrap up in a few minutes, there are a series of regulatory burdens on what I would call the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem in the United States. If you look at the US case, regulatory costs account for about 14% of US GDP. So that's nearly $2 trillion. Tort costs in the United States account for about 2% of GDP. That is equivalent, if not a little bit more, than total private sector investment in research and development. So there are several inhibitors to the scaling up and the start of ventures. And then, of course, when you look at countries like China, but there are others, there are other interesting models, whether you're talking about sovereign wealth funds or national development banks, that are finding ways to bridge this scale-up valley of death. And I think there's quite a bit that the United States still has to learn in regard to this. Now I'm going to just end on what I would call near-term or recent policy responses in the US case that are public sector driven or, to the ambassador's point, public and private partnerships. The first is the Startup Act. This was introduced about a month ago, early December 2011. This act's purpose is to really turbocharge, revivify, innovate, the entrepreneurial environment in the United States. It has a couple of major goals, one of which is to, back to the immigration point, make it easier for immigrants to come into the United States, whether it's providing green cards for foreign students who've earned science, technology, engineering, math degrees in the United States, to offering visas to entrepreneurs who actually create jobs for US workers. So there are a couple of schemes that are underway. There are also some plans in the Startup Act to reduce the regulatory burden that I mentioned. For example, there's a call to sunset rules and regulations that have been put into place for over 10 years. If you look at the US regulatory codes, there are just regulations that have been there for decades and perhaps for no good purpose. So many, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about the Startup Act, but I would also encourage you to Google it. It's a fairly innovative, bipartisan approach to trying to restart the US entrepreneurship engine. And then finally, I'll mention Startup America. This is a public-private partnership organized by the White House, but really led and driven by Steve Case, the former CEO and chairman of AOL. And the purpose of the partnership is to bring together companies, medium-sized to large, to help provide commitments to train, mentor, engage small entrepreneurs. And so this is an innovative, there's been about $1 billion worth of these explicit or in-kind commitments that these companies are making to American entrepreneurship, and so we'll be interested to see where this goes. And there's a very tight link between this public-private partnership, the pursuit of this legislative act, and to really try to engage the White House, Congress, and other agencies in this entrepreneurship engine. I'm going to skip that last point, and then just simply say, I think we talked about this in our sort of pre-session. The other thing I think that's important for the public sector when it's thinking about entrepreneurship is to build in the notion of failure. There will be mistakes. There will have to be an understanding of that. It's important to the point I think we've heard over the past 2 days about iteration. Just keep on doing it and see where we go from there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Well, I think you got a great diversity of opinion from different regions of the world, and so this is my favorite part of any program, the questions and answers. And so I'm looking forward to having your hands up and people with mics, and then we'll let at least one panelist answer the question, no more than two, so we can answer as many questions as we can. So, please.
Is this on? Okay. Hello, my name is Hajar. I'm a student. During this conference, and you also mentioned that it's important and it's a good thing that number of entrepreneurs are increasing in the region. But based on my observation, especially because now a lot of people, they're starting like home businesses and etc. Some kind, I feel like, I'm not sure is it an issue, but people, when they see that there's increase of business, the customers might like lose faith in this entrepreneurs, like say, like a lot of people are starting business. Why should I trust them? Because everyone is doing it. So is this an issue or not?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm going to let someone else answer that.
Let me try to give half an answer and let one of these guys give the rest of it. Yeah, it's always an issue with a startup business. And people don't know you, they don't know what you can really do, and sometimes the most, most important thing is to get that first customer, to get the first person who can go tell their friends where they got the product and what they did. It's a little funny for all of us, I think, as consumers these days. We get on the internet, we do a Google search on whatever we want to buy, and then you find all these providers, and that's why some of these outfits, eBay, et cetera, they have ratings for the different providers. So I think it's always existed. I think it's probably gotten easier with some of these tools out there to find new customers and have new customers find you and things like that. But establishing a business reputation takes a while. In the long run, I don't have the numbers right on top of my head, but startup businesses fail. Something like 50%, depending on the place, that businesses that are started fail. A few of them get huge. A lot of them stay small and medium. But these young, innovative startups, the ones that do succeed are the ones that create the most energy and the most jobs in an economy. And that's where the framework, giving them space. Because the worst thing is when somebody starts a business with a new idea and then they kind of get crushed or elbowed out of the way by some existing state-supported business.
Great. Anybody have a short comment?
I'd just say that I think
Michael,
there's a
thanks.
role for governance here, governments to make sure there's appropriate governance. As Richard said, businesses fail or not, but an investor should be able to make an informed decision based upon accurate facts and information. We've had some examples in the last 12 months, particularly out of emerging countries, of unscrupulous entrepreneurs going into markets and not having appropriate understanding of the requirements of actually putting out the facts so that investors can make informed decisions. And that's where the markets, the capital markets at each country that allow funds to be raised need to be very diligent in making sure that investors make an informed decision, because ultimately it will reflect not only on the individual investment, but on the reputation of their market.
Good. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Imad Al-Jadali from the International Medical Center. And my question to Mr. Richard, when you're talking about the policies, what are the success factors that you had from your experience, and what are the failures, again from your experience, and does the public engagement in policy making makes a difference or not? That's one. And the second thing is, do you prefer the approach bottom up or up down? Thank you.
Public involvement in policy making is absolutely essential. It's very hard to believe that anybody in government, and I was in government for a long time, knows exactly what everybody wants, knows exactly how to deliver a service in a way that people can use it, or provide an environment so that others can go out and do business. You got to talk. You got to talk to people in business. You got to talk to people in civil society. One of the big studies that we did a couple years ago was called "Making Reform Happen," and it was largely devoted to democracies and politics and stuff like that. But what we found was there were things that apply everywhere. And that's, if you're creating a service or redesigning a government service, you got to talk to the people who use it. And that means these public consultation process. So we work with a lot of governments and places to build in public consultations into the rulemaking process, the regulatory process. That sort of goes into your second question. I can't exactly remember. What was the second half? Oh, top down, bottom up. Bottom up, if the people in government are listening, that's all it takes. Sometimes it takes a combination of the both. But in the end, you've got to look at the environment, listen to people, and try to deliver what the citizens need. Because in the end, all the hard work, starting businesses, failing, offering products, offering services, in the end, that's largely done by people in the private sector. You've got to listen to them and figure out how to enable them to go out and do what they need to do.
Good. One other thing you might want to think about in terms of that is there's some great measurements of this, and hopefully OECD and maybe the Council on Competitiveness will start creating measurements so we can benchmark various countries on various things. The World Bank has some great measures that you can look at besides competitiveness. And one of the, I think, bigger failure factors, even in the companies I start, is not having enough capital to get started. And there's good ideas all over the world. There's great people all over the world. So those two ingredients are almost always there. But it's the capital, and how can the government help that process of capital formation or investing in people like you, particularly in the med space, which takes a longer period of time to start making a profit. Chad, and then we're going right over here.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one quick, you just raised something that I hadn't thought of, but with the ambassador here and this point about benchmarking. The council has been very lucky to partner with SAGIA in a venture called the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils, and one of my colleagues, Bill Bates, is here, who is the executive director of that effort. This is another effort to bring together councils of competitiveness around the world. And we've begun to undertake a benchmarking effort around innovation, competitiveness, and I think you've challenged us, and so I turn to my colleagues at SAGIA and to Bill and to, I see colleagues here from Korea and Brazil and Russia, and the UAE, to take this up. And so maybe that's a partnership we can engage in with the OECD and others.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yes, please.
Hello, Naif Sadoun. My question is related to motivation for government to innovate. It's understandable why countries with limited income from natural resources, why they want to change and innovate. But in countries like Saudi Arabia, they have lots of income from natural resources. So how can innovation in government be motivated here? Thank you.
Good question. I guess, go ahead.
Well, I come from a country which is very rich in resources, but it has an aspiration to be in the top 5 countries in the world in terms of size of economy, and certainly in the top 3 in terms of living standards. So I think the other thing is, if you're resource rich, we know that the commodity cycle is such that there will be trends through time, and you need to basically diversify your economy and your risk in that environment, that there'll be substitution or there'll be a price fall down the track. So therefore, governments need to take a long-term view of making sure that they sustain and build and grow the living standards of their people going forward, and don't just rely upon short-term commodity advantages or prices.
Let me just
please.
cite a couple factors. I think the biggest pressure right now on governments to innovate comes from money, lack of money in most cases. And that the people who are cutting budgets, people who don't have, governments that don't have the revenues that they used to have, that are feeling very tight, they're looking for more efficient ways of delivering government services. There are also cost increases. Big issue for many, many governments around the world is healthcare costs and how efficiently you can deliver healthcare, because aging populations and the cost of medical services rising so fast. You've got to find more efficient ways of delivering those services. A second one is popular pressure. Some of it's fairly benign, that people, you know, if you can do stuff on the internet with private companies and social organizations, you want to be able to do it with the government too. And so there's pressure for the government to keep up with what's going on out there in the internet world and the private world. And some of it's fairly active public pressure, as we've seen in many countries in the Middle East. So I think there's a lot of pressure on governments right now to innovate, and that's generally positive, and we see some new things going on.
Yeah, and I think there's another factor in this, is that it's just not been done for a long period of time, and it's the last of the 3 sectors, whether it be the private, individual, or corporate sector, to really get into this whole thing of entrepreneurship and innovation and that. And hopefully some organizations are going to start publishing some case studies and things like this where we can learn from each other and how to do this better. And then these measurement instruments would be good as well. Got time for one last question, if anyone has one. Oh, good. Who was it? Richard, you saw? No? Well, there we go. Great.
Hello, my name is Wafa. I just wanted to know if there are any basic conditions or criteria upon which we can evaluate or trust the success of a new business, especially if we are going to join that business. Is my question clear?
Could you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Are there any conditions or
you
criteria?
did very well. Much better in my Arabic, I can guarantee you. So,
are there any conditions or criteria upon which we can evaluate and trust the success of a new business if we are going to join that business? Let's say somebody started a little bit earlier than us and they want us to join. How can I trust that they are already starting successfully or based on a strong ground? Are there any basic things that I should look at before I join them?
anyone want to? Go ahead, Chad. You look like eager to answer.
I don't live my life in the world of business every day, so this perhaps is going to be naive. But when I think about entrepreneurship and innovation, that implies risk. Entrepreneurship and innovation does not happen without risk. So I think there's always going to be an unknown factor. So I think there obviously, if there are accounting issues, there are investment issues, transparency, some of the things we talked about earlier that are important to look at. But I think it would be, I don't think you can say there's never going to be, there's not going to be a silver bullet that's going to allow you to think, oh, this is the perfect investment choice. Otherwise, you know, what's the upside to that?
I would always look, first of all, to the integrity of management. You know, who's the person you're getting, who's going to be your partner? What are their ethics? What's their culture? Are they honest? Are they open with you? And, you know, what reference checks can you make about the, you know, the key man or the key person about their integrity? That goes a long way, I think, in terms of deciding who you should invest with.
And I'll just conclude by saying I think it's the whole culture of the country that has helped to be established by the government in terms of being able to have some kind of protection for failure, being able to encourage people to take the risks that go along with that, and have a culture that does not have a stigmatism applied to failure. And I think if you look at various countries, you can see the various dimensions of that. I want to thank you all. You've been a great audience. I really love being here, and I appreciate you all spending time with us. And I definitely want to give the panel members, because they really had some great comments.